how do you find that unique footage that really makes your films stand out?
About 90% of the material came from Memphis, but one thing that we did to make sure we had mined everything we could find in Memphis was we just started asking questions to people who might know, to people who were around at that time period. Do you know anyone who has any footage? And one of the people we discovered through that was a guy who was a radio dispatcher for the police. It was his second day on the job, the night that Martin Luther King was killed, and he kept all of the radio dispatch tapes from that evening in his garage. And through someone who knew someone, I got in touch with this guy. He lived way outside of Memphis. He said, you know, I've never shown these to anybody before. Come and meet me in this parking lot. It had a very deep throat kind of thing going on. And he was very afraid that he thought he would be taken advantage of or that I would steal his tapes. And after about a half an hour of sitting in his car and telling him who I was and what we were doing, he led me back to his house. And even at that point, I wasn't quite sure, you know, what I had gotten myself into. And he brought out these tapes, and we sat for hours, and we listened to all of the police radio dispatch from the evening that Dr. King was killed. And it was simply because I was curious, and I made sure to ask everyone whom I came in contact with, do you know anyone who has this kind of material?
If you're looking for a specific event, like let's say a bank robbery or an assassination or something, where you know there's only going to be one way to show it, then you have to find that. Then there's another category of footage, which is like the stuff that makes your movie great, but you may or may not need to use it. And so, you know, budget comes into play there also. I think it's like, for me, the strategy is always like you start and if you kind of know what your film is about, because it could also be about a very broad topic, like let's say you're making a film about, I don't know, the sexual revolution, you're going to have a lot of footage. I mean, you have to figure out which stories do you want to tell, which, you know. In our case, it always starts, I mean, you can basically go to like footage.net and search most archives now, like, and get an idea first of what's out there, or, you know, get people to work with you and do that. Then you can get in touch with the archives, and then beyond that, yes, I think like one of the most amazing thing you can do is what you just described. I mean, finding those audio tapes is like the holy grail, basically. If you can find stuff like that by getting in touch with the right people and doing detective work, I mean, you never know what you may or may not find, but that's the stuff that just makes, I think, personally, I feel it makes a documentary completely incredible. We have some of that in our film. It was very accidental. We found somebody who had owned a video camera in 1972 who interviewed some of the people that were involved with the story, and then you get into this whole crazy thing that, you know, the tapes have to be transferred. There's no place in the United States that can handle the format, and then we found a deck that was the size of a pool table. We, like, you know, almost destroyed the tape. I mean, it took like a few years before we had the footage and knew we could use it, but it's like the searching is great. It just depends also, I think, you were saying, you know, it's important to get people to help you. I think it depends on your time frame. For us, it was just 2 of us, and we took a decade to make this film in our spare time. So
I would also say that it depends on the subject. I find that for African American Black subjects, that people aren't categorized. So in other words, we might have a date about with the shootout, like the shootout between the Panthers and the police, but nowhere in that index was there any indication that Angela Davis was on the scene of the crime. It's like Afroed people talking, you know, or whatever. And so, which is to say that archives are not in the business of cataloging. So a lot of the material, depending on what you're looking for, you really do have to be the detective in a myriad of ways.
I think something that's a really important part of making a heavily archival film is really learning how to work with and take advantage of the people who are at the archives.
Yeah, I think there's never a better way than to actually look at material, because as Judy said, the cataloging over 50 years of a news archives can be spotty at times, can be very detailed, but the mentality of news archives was always, to get the material, get the news on air, and then the archival part, building an archive was usually a little bit of a second thought. So NBC, we did license for all these productions that everyone is speaking about. But you do have to be, even in a major news archives, have to be prepared to do some digging and probably view quite a lot of footage, depending on what you're going for. Just because something isn't necessarily listed that doesn't mean that it may not be somewhere in the footage. So we, I know at NBC, we do encourage that to doc filmmakers to try to see a lot of material, because you'll see that, of course, there's a lot of material now digitized on websites and in clip form, and as Judy said, a lot of it may be things that have been seen over and over again and kind of popular things. But if you're really looking for a particular subject, or really kind of maybe trying to find things that haven't been seen so much, then you do have to be prepared to spend some time digging. And at NBC, we have a very experienced research staff to help you usually with that kind of process.
I wanted to say something along those lines that Scott was talking about. You have to think in terms of, especially with news footage, what a news editor or a news producer at the time was going through. The camera operator, the camera crew had been out shooting all day, and they needed to cut a package of minute 25 for the evening news. And in trying to figure out where there's footage, well, there's footage on those tapes. They kept shooting. They were shooting all day long, and only small bits were taken in order to do the news package. So when I call Scott up, I'll say, I found this piece of footage, but I want to see the entire reel. I want to see all the raw footage. And he'll say, no, you don't. You don't want to see all the footage. Be like, yes, I want to see the raw footage. I want to see I want to see the reporters as they're getting ready to go on the air. I want to hear what they're talking about. And you'd be amazed how many stories are shelved on tape that will never see the light of day unless somebody goes through them and is willing to take the time.
In fact, isn't it the case that the archive is actually all the outtakes and not all, generally what hit the news is not there?
No, I mean, at NBC, we usually have the cut stories, at least if we're talking farther back, we're talking into the 70s and 60s. Most of the time there's a cut story, and sometimes there is those outtakes. But sometimes you can't really figure out why things were saved and why things weren't saved in an archive, especially in the 60s and 70s. Again, it's the news was getting it on air, and whatever was going on that day in 1973, why something was saved in a can and why something was not, and why something perhaps was thrown out because they didn't think it had any historical value. And of course, now it would be gold to find. But we do keep mostly the cut stories, and there is outs on raw footage additionally as well.